So just before I start, guys, Mr. Giles, I'm sorry if you're in the audience. Can you guys hear me properly? Can you guys like hear me? Like, am I clear to all of you guys? All right. Now, based off of the image sitting behind me and my appearance, you can probably tell that I love Bollywood films. There's just something so intriguing about the dancing and the romancing and the endlessly funny stories that go behind these epic movies. And in a recent trip to Bangladesh, my home country, I had really high expectations for my country. I guess you could say I expected dancing and romancing all over the streets of Bangladesh. And in that moment, I realized something shocking, that the story of Bollywood was just that. A story. Instead of seeing dancing and romancing in the streets of Bangladesh, I saw pollution and poverty plaguing my nation. And after a little bit of thinking and consideration, I came to the realization that this stark disconnect between the stories that we are told and the reality of the world around us transcends far beyond Bangladesh's borders. Ladies and gentlemen, you probably already know this, but we are an inherently storytelling society. We each seek to assign our confused, scattered experiences with a sense of coherence by arranging the episodes of our lives into stories. In fact, author Jonathan Gochel writes that the storytelling mind that you and I share is addicted to meaning. When we can find meaningful patterns in the world that align with the narrative structures of our stories, that is when our mind churns out true stories. But when the world doesn't match up with the narrative structure of our stories, that is when the mind begins crafting lies. And that is where the problem stands. Too often we allow for the simplified narrative structure of our stories to cloud us from the complexity of the real world. Hi everyone, my name is Raheel Parvez, and today I want to talk to you guys about the stories that we are told and the stories we tell ourselves. Firstly, I want to talk about how these stories and often one-sided narratives cause us to fundamentally misunderstand our past. Secondly, I want to talk about how these narratives shape and influence how we perceive and bias in the present. And last but not least, thirdly, I want to talk about how we as a society can jump over the hurdle of these destructive narratives and embrace the complexity of the real world instead of oversimplifying it. Because beneath the complexity of the real world lies a beautiful human truth. Now, moving to my first point. When we insist on seeing complex real-world information, especially that of our past, through the narrative lens, our perspective on reality can go awry. In fact, false narrativization plagues even our very classrooms throughout the world. Essentially, in fact, according to a report published by Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, the United States and its educational system is a key example of this notion. As early as elementary school, students in the US are taught about the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that America stands above all. In fact, students are not only taught that America writes history, they are taught that they edit it, they publish it, and they put it on a pedestal draped in the stars and stripes of the great American flag. Take, for example, Christopher Columbus, the man who we all know and love as the guy who went like this and said, "Oh, that's America." As early as elementary school within the United States, Christopher Columbus is hailed as the visionary who discovered America. Of course, we do overlook the fact that he was actually looking for India. And additionally, another thing we seem to overlook is how Christopher Columbus genocidally killed 10,000 of the indigenous Arawakian people of America. We seem to celebrate his discovery while he simultaneously buried the bodies of those he discovered. Now, who are my world studies teachers here? No one? That's a fantastic point to add to your curriculum, by the way, just to say, it's a good point. Now, moving on to a more serious note, this is a potent example of how false narrativization reduces often complex and horrifying historical events down into filtered, flattering, and fabricated comic book versions of reality. But now that you know how false narratives impact our past, You might be asking, how do they go forward and impact us in the present? Well, this brings me to my second key point. We have often unfortunately learned as a society that the narratives we let propagate through society are not always benign. In fact, they can wound as much as we perceive them to heal. Because unfortunately, false narratives take an infinitely complex person and turn them into a two-dimensional cartoon caricature in a false tale. When we allow these false narratives to propagate through our society, we strip people of their struggles, their hopes, their dignity. In fact, according to a study published by Harvard University in millions of implicit association tests, which are tests geared towards identifying prejudicial biases, 70 to 80%, to put that into numerical context, that's 7 to 8 out of every 10 people in this room have some kind of implicit prejudicial bias against racially marginalized groups. Now, I've shown you guys a bunch of numbers and tried to convey an argument to you guys. But in order to truly see how deep the wounds inflicted by false narrativization are, we must look past the data, the statistics, the facts, the numbers, and we must look into the stories and truths they obscure. And nowhere is this as heartbreakingly apparent as after the events of September 11th of 2001. In that moment, our grieving world implemented what author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie dubs the danger of a single story. An international narrative where all Muslims, people like me, and maybe some of you in the audience, are international villains. And one of the most heartbreaking instances I came across was just 4 days after these attacks. Waqar Hassan, a Pakistani immigrant, a person just like you and me, was killed in a grocery store in Texas. You might ask, what was his crime? Well, his crime was wearing a face that fit the narrative. In that moment, the American dream Waqar Hassan had as a Pakistani immigrant was now the American nightmare for his grieving family. The flag he once hoped to salute, the great stars and stripes of the American flag, were now draped over his dead body. Because that's what false narratives do. They take an infinitely complex person just like you and me, and they boil them down to a single damning word. Waqar Hassan, a person just like you and me, a loving family man? No. A terrorist, a villain, other, someone who is not worth society's respect. And unfortunately, Waqar Hassan isn't the only victim of this. Time and time again throughout our history, we have seen the wounds that false narrativization inflicts. We saw it with the Jews and the Holocaust during World War II, where millions were killed. We saw it with the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. We saw it with the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. We have seen too many times how our false narratives not only strip people of their struggles, their hopes, or their dignity, it sometimes strips people of their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to write a new story. It is time to turn our narratives on the head and recognize the reality that they obscure. We must understand that they cause us to fundamentally misunderstand our relationships. We must understand that they take infinitely complex people and turn them into cartoon caricatures in a two-dimensional tale. We must create a society where, to paraphrase author Charles Dickens, we can all be the heroes of our own story, regardless of race, ideology, gender, socioeconomic status, religion, or beliefs. A world where heroes don't have to fight those they call villains. I know, it's a nice slide, isn't it? Thank you, Mr. Bell. So, if you're going to take away one thing from my TED Talk, take away this. And I'm going to end on the corniest note ever, and you guys probably know what I'm going to do. Life is not a Bollywood movie. It's not filled with the dancing and the romancing we all associate with it, but rather it's grounded in complexity. It's grounded in a beautiful human truth. And when we embrace that complexity instead of oversimplifying our world, that is when the dance, the Bollywood dance of life, is not exclusive. It's when we can live together harmoniously as a society, where we can dance together. Thank you very much.